The Phenomena of Sexual Periodicity, Part 3, Section 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 1 by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by John Thomas Coos. The Phenomena of Sexual Periodicity, Part 3, Section 3. It has long been known that the occurrence of insanity follows an annual curve, and though our knowledge of this curve, being founded on the data of admissions to asylums, cannot be said to be quite precise, it fairly corresponds to the outbreaks of acute insanity. The curve presented in Chart 4 shows the admissions to the London County Council lunatic asylums during the years 1893 to 1897 inclusive. I have arranged it in 2-month periods to neutralize unimportant oscillations. In order to show that this curve is not due to local or accidental circumstances, we may turn to France and take a special and chronic form of mental disease. Garnier, in his Folie à Paris, presents an almost exactly similar curve of the admissions of cases of general paralysis to the Infirmerie Spéciale à Paris during the years 1886 to 88. Chart 5. Both curves alike show a major climax in spring and a minor climax in autumn. Crime, in general, in temperate climates, tends to reach its maximum at the beginning of the hot season, usually in June. Thus, in Belgium, the minimum is in February, the maximum in June, thence gradually diminishing. Lentz, Bulletin Société Médecine Mentale Belgique, March 1901. In France, La Cassagne has summated the data extending over more than 40 years, and finds that for all crimes, June is the maximum month, the minimum being reached in November. He also gives the figures for each class of crimes separately, and every crime is found to have its own yearly curve. Poisonings show a chief maximum in May, with slow fall and a minor climax in December. Assassinations have a February and a November climax. Patricides culminate in May, June, and in October. La Cassagne's tables are given by Laurent, Les Habitués des Prisons de Paris, Chapter 1. Notwithstanding the general tendency for crime to reach its maximum in the first hot month, a tendency not necessarily due to the direct influence of heat, we also find, when we consider the statistics of crime generally, including sexual crime, that there is another tendency for minor climaxes in spring and autumn. Thus, in Italy, Penta, taking the statistics of nearly 4,000 crimes, murder, highway robbery, and sexual offenses, found the maximum in the first summer months, but there were also minor climaxes in spring and in August and September. Penta, Rivista Mensile di Psychiatria, 1899. In nearly all Europe, as shown by a diagram given by Lombroso and Laschi at the end of the first volume of Les Crimes Politiques, while the chief climaxes occur about July, there is, in most countries, a distinct tendency to spring, usually about March, and autumn, September and November, climaxes, though they rarely rise as high as the July climax. If we consider the separate periodicity of sexual offenses, we find that they follow the rule for crimes generally, and usually show a chief maximum in early summer. Aschaffenburg finds that the annual periodicity of the sexual impulse appears more strongly marked the more abnormal its manifestations, which he places in the following order of increasing periodicity: conceptions in marriage, conceptions out of marriage, offenses against decency, rape, assaults on children. Centrale Blay, Vernevenlukund, January 1903. In France, rapes and offenses against modesty are most numerous in May, June, and July. as Villermé, Lacassagne, and others have shown. Villermé, investigating 1,000 such cases, found a gradual ascent in frequency, only slightly broken in March, to a maximum in June, oscillating between May and July, when the years are considered separately, and then a gradual descent to a minimum in December. Legludic gives, for the 159 cases he had investigated, a table showing a small February-March climax and a large June-August maximum, the minimum being reached in November-January. Legludic étendant aux Marus, 1896, page 16. In Germany, Aschaffenburg finds that sexual offenses begin to increase in March and April, reach a maximum in June or July, and fall to a minimum in winter. Monatsschrift für Psychiatrie, 1903, Heft 2. In Italy, Penta shows that sexual offenses reach a minor climax in May, corresponding, in his experience, with the maximum for crimes generally, as well as with the maximum for conceptions, and a more marked climax in August-September. Penta 1 Perventimenti Sessuali, 1893, page 115, ID Revista Mensuelle de Psychiatrie, 1899. Coe, in his Crime en Pays Creole, presents charts of the seasonal distribution of crime in Guadeloupe, with relation to temperature, which show that while in a mild temperature like that of France and England, crime attains its maximum in the hot season. It is not so in a more tropical climate, in July, when in Guadeloupe the heat attains its maximum degree. Crime of all kind falls suddenly to a very low minimum. Even in the United States, where the summer heat is often excessive, it tends to produce a diminution of crime. Dexter, in an elaborate study of the relationship of conduct to the weather, shows that in the United States assaults present the maximum of frequency in April and October, with a decrease during the summer and the winter. The unusual and interesting fact demonstrated here, with a certainty that cannot be doubted, is, he concludes, that the unseasonably hot days of spring and autumn are the pugnacious ones, even though the actual heat be much less than for summer. We might infer from this that conditions of heat, up to a certain extent, are vitalizing, while at the same time irritating. But above that limit, heat is so devitalizing in its effects as to leave hardly energy enough to carry on a fight. E.g. Dexter, Conduct and the Weather, 1899, page 63, et sequence. It is not impossible that the phenomena of seasonal periodicity in crimes may possess a real significance in relation to sexual periodicity, if, as is possible, the occurrence of spring and autumn climaxes of criminal activity is due less to any special exciting causes at these seasons than to the depressing influences of heat and cold in summer and winter. It may appear reasonable to ask whether the spring and autumn climaxes of sexual activity are not really also largely due to a like depressing influence of extreme temperatures at the other two seasons. Not only is there periodicity in criminal conduct, but even within the normal range of good and bad conduct, seasonal periodicity may still be traced. In his Physical and Industrial Training of Criminals, H.D. Way gives charts of the conduct of 7 prisoners during several years, as shown by the marks received. These charts show that there is a very decided tendency to behavior during summer and winter, while in spring, February, March, and April, and in autumn, August, September, and October, there are very marked falls to bad conduct, each individual tending to adhere to a conduct curve of his own. Way does not himself appear to have noticed this seasonal periodicity. Morrow, however, has investigated this question in Turin on a large scale and reaches results not very dissimilar from those shown by Way's figures in New York. He noted the months in which over 4,000 punishments were inflicted on prisoners for assaults, insults, threatening language, etc., and shows the annual curve in Tavola 6 of his Caratteri dei Delinquenti. There is a marked and isolated climax in May. A still more sudden rise leads to the chief maximum of punishment in August, and from the minimum in October there is rapid ascent during the 2 following months to a climax much inferior to that of May. The seasonal periodicity of bad conduct in prisons is of interest as showing that we cannot account for psychic periodicity by invoking exclusively social causes. This theory of psychic periodicity has been seriously put forward, but has been investigated and dismissed, so far as crime in Holland is concerned, by J.R.B. de Roos in the Transactions of the Sixth Congress of Criminal Anthropology at Turin in 1906. Archivo di Psichiatria, Fash 3, 1906. The general statistics of suicides in continental Europe show a very regular and unbroken curve, attaining a maximum in June and a minimum in December, the curve rising steadily through the first 6 months, sinking steadily through the last 6 months, but always reaching a somewhat greater height in May than in July. Morselli shows that in various European countries there is always a rise in spring and in autumn, October or November. Morselli attributes these spring and autumn rises to the influence of the strain of the early heat and the early cold. In England also, if we take a very large number of statistics, for instance, the figures for London during the 20 years between 1865 and 1884, as given by Ogle in a paper read before the Statistical Society in 1886, we find that although the general curve has the same maximum and minimum points, it is interrupted by a break on each side of the maximum, and these 2 breaks occur precisely at about March and October. This is shown in the curve in Chart 6, which presents the daily average for the different months. The growth of children follows an annual rhythm. Wall, the director of an educational establishment for homeless girls in Denmark, who investigated this question, found that the increase of weight for all the ages investigated was constantly about 33% greater in the summer half year than in the winter half year. It was noteworthy that even the children who had not reached school age, and therefore could not be influenced by school life, showed a similar, though slighter, difference in the same direction. It is, however, Malling Hensen, the director of an institution for deaf-mutes in Copenhagen, who has most thoroughly investigated this matter over a great many years. He finds that there are 3 periods of growth throughout the year, marked off in a fairly sharp manner, and that during each of these periods the growth in weight and height shows constant characteristics. From about the end of November up to about the end of March is a period when growth both in height and weight proceeds at a medium rate, reaching neither a maximum nor a minimum. Increase in weight is slight, the increase in height, although trifling, preponderating. After this follows a period during which the children show a marked increase in height, while increase in weight is reduced to a minimum. The children constantly lose in weight during this period of growth in height, almost as much as they gain in the preceding period. This period lasts from March and April to July and August. Then following the 3rd period, which continues until November and December. During this period, increase in height is very slight, being at its early minimum. Increase in weight, on the other hand, at the beginning of the period, in September and October, is rapid, and to the middle of December very considerable, daily increase in weight being 3 times as great as during the winter months. Thus, it may be said that the spring sexual climax corresponds roughly with growth in height and arrest of growth in weight, while the autumn climax corresponds roughly with a period of growth in weight and arrest of growth in height. Malling Hansen found that slight variations in the growth of the children were often dependent on changes in temperature, in such a way that a rise of temperature, even lasting for only a few days, caused an increase of growth, and a fall of temperature a decrease in growth. At Hall, Schmidt-Menard found that nearly all growth in weight took place in the second half of the year, and that the holidays made little difference. In America, Peckham has shown that increase of growth is chiefly from the 1st of May to the 1st of September. Among young girls in St. Petersburg, Jenchko found that increase in weight takes place in summer. Gopal found that increase in height takes place mostly during the first 8 months of the year, reaching a maximum in August, declining during the autumn and winter, and February being nil, while in March there is sometimes loss in weight even in healthy children. In the course of a study as to the consumption of bread in normal schools during each month of the year, as illustrating the relationship between intellectual work and nutrition, Binet presents a number of curves which bring out results to which he makes no allusion, as they are outside his own investigation. Almost without exception, these curves show that there is an increase in the consumption of bread in spring and in autumn. The spring rise being in February, March, and April, the autumn rise in October or November. There are, however, certain fallacies in dealing with institutions like normal schools, where the conditions are not perfectly regular throughout the year, owing to vacations, etc. It is, therefore, instructive to find that under the monotonous conditions of prison life, precisely the same spring and autumn rises are found. Binet takes the consumption of bread in the women's prison at Clermont, where some 400 prisoners, chiefly between the ages of 30 and 40, are confined, and he presents two curves for the years 1895 and 1896. The curves for these 2 years show certain marked disagreements with each other, but both unite in presenting a distinct rise in April, preceded and followed by a fall, and both present a still more marked autumn rise, in one case in September and November, in the other case in October. Some years ago, Sir J. Crichton Browne stated that a manifestation of the sexual stimulus of spring is to be found in the large number of novels read during the month of March. Address in Psychology at the annual meeting of the British Medical Association, Leeds, 1889, Lancet, August 14th, 1889. The statement was supported by figures furnished by lending libraries and has been widely copied. It would certainly be interesting if we could so simply show the connection between love and season by proving that when the birds began to sing their notes, the young person's fancy naturally turns to brood over the pictures of mating in novels. I accordingly applied to Mr. Capel Shaw, Chief Librarian of the Birmingham Free Libraries, specially referred to by Sir J. Crichton Browne, who furnished me with the reports for 1896 and 1897-98. This latter report is carried on to the end of March 1898. The readers who use the Birmingham Free Lending Libraries are about 30,000 in number. They consist very largely of young people between the ages of 14 and 25. Somewhat less than half are women. Certainly, we seem to have here a good field for the determination of this question. The monthly figures for each of the 10 Birmingham libraries are given separately, and it is clear at a glance that without exception the maximum number of readers of prose fiction at all the libraries during 1897-98 is found in the month of March. I have chiefly taken into consideration the figures for 1897-98. The figures for 1896 are somewhat abnormal and irregular, probably owing to a decrease in readers, attributed to increased activity in trade, and partly to a disturbing influence caused by the opening of a large new library in the course of the year, certainly increasing the number of readers, and drafting off borrowers from some kind of other libraries. Not only so, but there is a second or autumnal climax, almost equaling the spring climax, and occurring with equal certainty, appearing during 1897-98, either in October or November, and during 1896, constantly in October. Thus, the periodicity of the rate of consumption of prose fiction corresponds with the periodicity which is found to occur in the consumption rate and in sexual ecbolic manifestations. It is necessary, however, to examine somewhat more closely the tables presented in these reports and to compare the rate of the consumption of novels with that of the other classes of literature. In the first place, if, instead of merely considering the consumption of novels per month, we make allowance for the varying length of the months and consider the average daily consumption per month, the supremacy of March at once vanishes. February is really the month during which most novels are read during the first quarter of 1898, except at two libraries where February and March are equal. The result is similar if we ascertain the daily averages for the first quarter in 1897, while in 1896, which, however, as I have already remarked, is a rather abnormal year. The daily average for March in many of the libraries falls below that for January, as well as for February. Again, when we turn to the other classes of books, we find that this predominance which February possesses, and to some extent shares with March and January, by no means exclusively applies to novels. It is not only shared by both music and poetry, which would fit in well with the assumption of a sexual nisus, but the department of history, biography, voyages, and travels shares it also with considerable regularity. So, also, does that of arts, sciences, and natural history, and it is quite well marked in theology, moral philosophy, etc., and in juvenile literature. We even have to admit that the promptings of the sexual instinct bring an increased body of visitors to the reference library, where there are no novels, for here, also, both the spring and autumnal climaxes are quite distinct. Certainly, this theory carries us a little too far. The main factor in producing this very marked annual periodicity seems to me to be wholly unconnected with the sexual impulse. The winter half of the year, from the beginning of October to the end of March, when outdoor life has lost its attractions and much time must be spent in the house, is naturally the season for reading. But during the two central months of winter, December and January, the attraction of reading meets with a powerful counter-attraction in the excitement produced by the approach of Christmas, and the increased activity of social life which accompanies and for several weeks follows Christmas. In this way, the other 4 winter months, October and November at the autumnal end, and February and March at the spring end, must inevitably present the 2 chief reading climaxes of the year, and so the reports of lending libraries present us with figures which show a striking but fallacious resemblance to curves which are probably produced by more organic causes. I am far from wishing to deny that the impulse which draws young men and women to imaginative literature is unconnected with the obscure promptings of the sexual instinct, but until the disturbing influence I have just pointed out is eliminated, I see no evidence here for any true seasonal periodicity. Possibly in prisons, the value of which as laboratories of experimental psychology we have scarcely yet begun to realize, more reliable evidence might be obtained, and those French and other prisons where novels are freely allowed to the prisoners might yield evidence as regards the consumption of fiction as instructive as that yielded at Claremont concerning the consumption of bread. Certain diseases show a very regular annual curve. There is notably the case with scarlet fever. Kager found in a London fever hospital a marked seasonal prevalence. There was a minor climax in May, repeated in July, and a great autumnal climax in October, falling to a minimum in December and January. This curve corresponds closely to that usually observed in London. It is not peculiar to London or to urban districts, for in rural districts we find nearly the same spring minor maximum and major autumnal maximum. In Russia it is precisely the same. Many other epidemic diseases show very similar curves. An annual curve may be found in the expulsive force of the bladder as measured by the distance to which the urinary stream can be projected. This curve, as ascertained for one case, is interesting in account of the close relationship between sexual and vesical activity. After a minimum point in autumn, there is a rise through the early part of the year to a height maintained through spring and summer and reaching its maximum in August. This may be said to correspond with the general tendency found in some cases of nocturnal seminal emissions from a winter minimum to an autumn maximum. There is an annual curve in voluntary muscle strength. Thus, in Antwerp, where the scientific study of children is systematically carried out by a pedagogical bureau, Schouten found that measured by the dynamometer, both at the ages of 8 and 9, both boys and girls showed a gradual increase of strength from October to January, a fall from January to March, and a rise to June or July. March was the weakest month, June and July the strongest. Schouten also found an annual curve for mental ability, as tested by power of attention, which for much of the year corresponded to the curve of muscular strength, being high during the cold winter months. Lobsien at Kiel, seeking to test Scheuten's results and adopting a different method so as to gauge memory as well as attention, came to conclusions which confirmed those of Schouten. They found a very marked increase of ability in December and January, with a fall in April. April and May were the minimum months, while July and October also stood low. The inquiries of Schouten and Lobsien thus seem to indicate that the voluntary aptitudes of muscular and mental force in children reach their maximum at a time of year when most of the more or less involuntary activities we have been considering show a minimum of energy. If this conclusion should be confirmed by more extended investigations, it would scarcely be matter for surprise and would involve no true contradiction. It would, indeed, be natural to suppose that the voluntary and regulated activities of the nervous system should work most efficiently at those periods when they are least exposed to organic and emotional disturbance. So persistent a disturbing element in spring and autumn suggests that some physiological conditions underlie it, and that there is a real metabolic disturbance at these times of the year. So few continuous observations have yet been made on the metabolic processes of the body that it is not easy to verify such a surmise with absolute precision. Edward Smith's investigations, so far as they go, support it. Perry Cost's long-continued observations of pulse frequency seem to show with fair regularity a maximum in early spring and another maximum in late autumn. I may also note that Haig, who has devoted many years of observations to the phenomena of uric acid excretion, finds that uric acid tends to be highest in the spring months, March, April, May, and lowest at the first onset of cold in October. Thus, while the sexual climaxes of spring and autumn are rooted in animal procreative cycles, which in man have found expression in primitive festivals, these again perhaps strengthening and developing the sexual rhythm, they yet have a wider significance. They constitute one among many manifestations of spring and autumn physiological disturbance corresponding with fair precision to the vernal and autumnal equinoxes. They resemble those periods of atmospheric tension, of storm and wind, which accompany the spring and autumn phases in the earth's rhythm, and they may fairly be regarded as ultimately a psychological reaction to those cosmic influences. End of the Phenomena of Sexual Periodicity, Part 3, Section 3. Recording by John Thomas Coos.
Study of the Spontaneous Manifestations of the Sexual Impulse, Part 1, Section 1 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 1, by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christopher Most. Autoeroticism, a study of the spontaneous manifestations of the sexual impulse, Part 1, Section 1. By autoeroticism I mean the phenomena of spontaneous sexual emotion generated in the absence of an external stimulus proceeding, directly or indirectly, from another person. In a wide sense, which cannot be wholly ignored here, autoeroticism may be said to include those transformations of repressed sexual activity which are a factor of some morbid conditions as well as of the normal manifestation of art and poetry, and indeed, more or less color the whole life. Such a definition excludes the normal sexual excitement aroused by the presence of a beloved person of the opposite sex. It also excludes the perverted sexuality associated with an attraction to the person of the same sex. It further excludes the manifold forms of erotic fetishism, in which the normal focus of sexual attraction is displaced, and voluptuous emotions are aroused only by some object, hair, shoes, garments, etc., which, to the ordinary lover, are of subordinate, though still indeed considerable importance. The autoerotic field remains extensive. It ranges from occasional voluptuous daydreams, in which the subject is entirely passive, to the perpetual unashamed efforts at sexual self-manipulation witnessed among the insane. It also includes, though chiefly as curiosities, those cases in which individuals fall in love with themselves. Among autoerotic phenomenon, or on the borderland, we must further include those religious sexual manifestations for an ideal object, of which we may find evidence in the lives of saints and ecstatics. The typical form of autoeroticism is the occurrence of the sexual orgasm during sleep. I do not know that any apology is needful for the invention of the term autoerotism. There is no existing word in current use to indicate the whole range of phenomena I am here concerned with. We are familiar with masturbation, but that, strictly speaking, only covers a special and arbitrary subdivision of the field, although, it is true, the subdivision with which physicians and alienists have chiefly occupied themselves. Self-abuse is somewhat wider, but by no means covers the whole ground, while for various reasons it is an unsatisfactory term. Onanism is largely used, especially in France, and some writers even include all forms of homosexual connection under this name. It may be convenient to do so from a physiological point of view, but it is a confusing and antiquated mode of procedure, and from the psychological standpoint altogether illegitimate. Onanism ought never to be used in this connection, if only on the ground that Onan's device was not autoerotic, but an early example of withdrawal before emission, or coitus interruptus. While the name that I have chosen may possibly not be the best, there should be no question as to the importance of grouping all these phenomena together. It seems to me that this field has rarely been viewed in a scientifically sound and morally sane light, simply because it has not been viewed as a whole. We have made it difficult so to view it by directing our attention on the special group of autoerotic facts, that group included under masturbation, which was most easy to observe, and which in an extreme form came plainly under medical observation in insanity and allied conditions, and we have wilfully torn this group of facts away from the larger group to which it naturally belongs. The questions which have been so widely, so diversely, and, it must unfortunately be added, often so mischievously discussed, concerning the nature and evils of masturbation are not seen in their true light and proportions until we realize that masturbation is but a specialized form of a tendency which in some form or in some degree normally affects not only man, but all higher animals. From a medical point of view it is often convenient to regard masturbation as an isolated fact, but in order to understand it we must bear in mind its relationships. In this study of autoerotism I shall frequently have occasion to refer to the old entity of masturbation, because it has been more carefully studied than any other part of the autoerotic field, but I hope it will always be borne in mind that the psychological significance and even the medical diagnostic value of masturbation cannot be appreciated unless we realize that it is an artificial subdivision from a great group of natural facts. The study of autoerotism is far from being an unimportant or merely curious study, yet psychologists, medical and non-medical, almost without exception, treat its manifestations, when they refer to them at all, in a dogmatic and offhand manner which is far from scientific. It is not surprising, therefore, that the most widely divergent opinions are expressed. Nor is it surprising that ignorant and chaotic notions among the general population should lead to results that would be ludicrous if they were not pathetic. To mention one instance known to me, a married lady who is a leader in social purity movements and an enthusiast for sexual chastity discovered, through reading some pamphlet against solitary vice, that she herself had been practicing masturbation for years without knowing it. The profound anguish and hopeless despair of this woman in face of what she believed to be the moral ruin of her whole life cannot be well described. It would be easy to give further examples, though a scarcely more striking one, to show utter confusion into which we are thrown by leaving this matter in the hands of the blind leaders of the blind. Moreover, the conditions of modern civilization render autoerotism a matter of increasing social significance. As our marriage rate declines, and as illicit sexual relationships continue to be openly discouraged, it is absolutely inevitable that autoerotic phenomena of one kind or another, not only among women, but among men, should increase among us both in amount and intensity. It becomes, therefore, a matter of some importance, both to the moralist and the physician, to investigate the psychological nature of these phenomena and to decide precisely what their attitude should be toward them. I do not purpose to enter into a thorough discussion of all the aspects of autoerotism. That would involve a very extensive study indeed. I wish to consider briefly certain salient points concerning autoerotic phenomenon, especially their prevalence, their nature, and their moral, physical, and other effects. I base my study partly on the facts and opinions which, during the last 30 years, have been scattered through the periodical and other medical literature of Europe and America, and partly on the experience of individuals, especially of fairly normal individuals. Among animals in isolation, and sometimes in freedom, though this can less often be observed, it is well known that various forms of spontaneous solitary sexual excitement occur. Horses, when leading a lazy life, may be observed flapping the penis until some degree of emission takes place. Welsh ponies, I learn from a man who has had much experience with these animals, habitually produce erections and emissions in their stalls. They do not bring their hindquarters up during this process, and they close their eyes, which does not take place when they have congress with mares. The same informant observed that bulls and goats produce emissions by using their forelegs as a stimulus, bringing up their hindquarters, and mares rub themselves against objects. I am informed by a gentleman who is a recognized authority on goats that they sometimes take the penis into the mouth and produce actual orgasm, thus practicing autofellatio. As regards ferrets, the Reverend H. Norcott states, I am informed by a gentleman who has had considerable experience of ferrets, that if the bitch, when in heat, cannot obtain a dog, she pines and becomes ill. If a smooth pebble is introduced into the hutch, she will masturbate upon it, thus preserving her normal health for one season. But if this artificial substitute is given to her a second season, she will not, as formerly, be content with it. Stags in the rutting season, when they have no partners, rub themselves against trees to produce ejaculation. Sheep masturbate, as also do camels, pressing themselves down against convenient objects, and elephants compress the penis between the hind legs to obtain emissions. Blumenbach observed a bear act somewhat similarly upon seeing other bears coupling, and hyenas, according to Ploss and Bartels, have been seen practicing mutual masturbation by licking each other's genitals. Mammary masturbation, remarks Ferreira, is found in certain female and even male animals, like the dog and cat. Apes are much given to masturbation, even in freedom, according to the evidence of good observers, for while no female apes are celibates, many of the males are obliged to lead a life of celibacy. Male monkeys use the hand in masturbation, to rub and shake the penis. In the human species these phenomena are by no means found in civilization alone. To whatever extent masturbation may have been developed by the conditions of European life, which carry to the utmost extreme the concomitant stimulation and repression of sexual emotions, it is far from being, as Mantegazza has declared it to be, one of the moral characteristics of Europeans. It is found among the people of nearly every race in which we have any intimate knowledge, however natural the conditions under which men and women may live. Thus, among the Nama Hottentots, among the young women at all events, Gustav Frisch found that masturbation is so common that it is to be regarded the custom of the country. No secret is made of it, and in the stories and legends of the race it is treated as one of the most ordinary facts of life. It is so also among the Basutos, and the Kafirs are addicted to the same habit. The Fuegians have a word for masturbation, and a special word for masturbation by women. When the Spaniards first arrived at Vizcaya, in the Philippines, they found that masturbation was universal, and that it was customary for the women to use an artificial penis and other abnormal methods of sexual gratification. Among the Balinese, according to Jacobs, as quoted by Ploss and Bartels, masturbation is general. In the boudoir of many a Bali beauty, he adds, and in every harem, may be found a wax penis to which many hours of solitude are devoted. Throughout the East, as Aram, speaking from a long medical experience, has declared, masturbation is very prevalent, especially among young girls. In Egypt, according to Sonnini, it is prevalent in harems. In India, a medical correspondent tells me he once treated the widow of a wealthy Mohammedan, who informed him that she began masturbation at an early age, just like all other women. The same informant tells me that on the facade of a large temple in Orissa are bas-reliefs, representing both men and women alone masturbating, and also women masturbating men. Among the Tamils of Ceylon masturbation is said to be common. In Cochin China, Lorion remarks, it is practiced by both sexes, but especially by the married women. Japanese women have probably carried the mechanical arts of autoerotism to the highest degree of perfection. They use two hollow balls, about the size of a pigeon's egg, sometimes one alone is used, which, as described by Jost, Christian, and others, are made of very thin leaves of brass. One is empty. The other, called the little man, contains a small heavy metal ball, or else some quicksilver, and sometimes metal tongues which vibrate when set in movement, so that if the balls are held in the hand side by side, there is a continuous movement. The empty one is first introduced into the vagina in contact with the uterus, then the other. The slightest movement of the pelvis or thighs, or even spontaneous movement of the organs causes the metal ball, or quicksilver, to roll, and the resulting vibration produces a prolonged voluptuous titillation, a gentle shock as from a weak electric inductive apparatus. The balls are called rin no tama, and are held in the vagina by a proper tampon. The women who use these balls delight to swing themselves in a hammock or rocking chair, the delicate vibration of the ball slowly producing the highest degree of sexual excitement. Jost mentions that this apparatus, though well known by name to ordinary girls, is chiefly used by the more fashionable geishas, as well as by prostitutes. Its use has now spread to China, Annam, and India. Japanese women also, it is said, frequently use an artificial penis of paper and clay called engi. Among the Atche, again, according to Jacobs, as quoted by Ploss, the young of both sexes masturbate and the elder girls use an artificial penis of wax. In China, also, the artificial penis, made of rosin, supple, and, like the classical instrument described by Harandas, rose-colored, is publicly sold and widely used by women. It may be noticed that among non-European races it is among women, and especially among those who are subjected to the excitement of a life professionally devoted to some form of pleasure, that the use of the artificial instruments of autoerotism is chiefly practiced. The same is markedly true in Europe. The use of an artificial penis in solitary sexual gratification may be traced down from classic times, and doubtless prevailed in the very earliest human civilization, for such an instrument is said to be represented in old Babylonian sculptures, and it is referred to by Ezekiel, chapter 16, verse 17. The lesbian women are said to have used such instruments, made of ivory or gold with silken stuffs and linen. Aristophanes, in Lysistrata, verse 109, speaks of the manufacture by Milesian women of leather artificial penis, or lisbos. In the British Museum is a vase representing the hetaira holding such instruments, when, as found at Pompeii, may be seen in the museum at Naples. One of the best of Herondas's mimes, The Private Conversation, presents a dialogue between two ladies concerning a certain Olisbos, which one of them vaunts as a dream of delight. Through the Middle Ages, when from time to time the clergy reprobated the use of such instruments, they continued to be known, and after the 15th century the references to them became more precise. Thus Fortini, the Sienese novelist of the 16th century, refers in his Novelle del Novizi, 7th day, novella 34, to the glass object filled with warm water which nuns use to calm the sting of the flesh, and to satisfy themselves as well as they can. He adds that widows and other women anxious to avoid pregnancy availed themselves of it. In Elizabethan England, at the same time, it appears to have been of a similar character, and Marston, in his satires, tells how Lucia prefers a glassy instrument to her husband's lukewarm bed. In 16th century France, also, such instruments were sometimes made of glass, and Brantôme refers to the Godmiche. In 18th century Germany they were called Samthanse, and their use, according to Heinz, as quoted by Düren, was common among aristocratic women. In England, by that time, the dildo appears to have become common. Archamholtz states that while in Paris they are sold secretly. In London, a certain Mrs. Phillips sold them openly on a large scale in her shop in Leicester Square. John B., in 1835, stating that the name was originally Dill Doll, remarks that their use was formerly commoner than it was in his day. In France, Madame Gourdin, the most notorious brothel keeper of the 18th century, carried on a wholesale trade in consolateurs, as they were called, and at her death numberless letters from abbesses and simple nuns were found among her papers, asking for a consolateur to be sent. The modern French instrument is described by Gamier as of hardened red rubber, exactly imitating the penis, and capable of holding warm milk or other fluid for injection at the moment of orgasm. The compressible scrotum is said to have been first added in the 18th century. In Islam, the artificial penis has reached nearly as high development as in Christendom. Turkish women use it, and it is said to be openly sold in Smyrna. In the harems of Zanzibar, according to Baumann, it is of considerable size, carved out of ebony or ivory, and commonly bored so that warm water may be injected. It is here regarded as an Arab invention. Somewhat similar appliances may be traced in all centers of civilization, but throughout they appear to be frequently confined to the world of prostitutes and to those women who live on the fashionable or semi-artistic verge of that world. Ignorance and delicacy combine with a less versatile and perverted concentration on the sexual impulse to prevent any general recourse to such highly specialized methods of solitary gratification. On the other hand, the use, or rather abuse, of the ordinary objects and implements of daily life in obtaining autoerotic gratification among the ordinary population in civilized modern lands has reached an extraordinary degree of extent and variety we can only feebly estimate by the occasional resulting mischances which come under the surgeon's hands, because only a certain proportion of such instruments are dangerous. Thus the banana seems to be widely used for masturbation by women, and appears to be marked out for the purpose by its size and shape. It is, however, innocuous, and never comes under the surgeon's notice. The same may probably be said of the cucumbers and other vegetables more especially used by country and factory girls in masturbation. A lady living near Vichy told Polier that she had often heard, and had herself been able to verify the fact, that the young peasant women commonly used turnips, carrots, and beetroots. In the 18th century Mirabeau, in his Erotica Biblion, gave a list of the various objects used in convents, which he describes as vast theatres of such practices, to obtain solitary sexual excitement. In more recent years the following are a few of the objects found in the vagina or bladder whence they could only be removed by surgical interference: pencils, sticks of sealing wax, cotton reels, hairpins, and in Italy very commonly the bone pins used in the hair, bodkins, knitting needles, crochet needles, needle cases, compasses, glass stoppers, candles, corks, tumblers, forks, toothpicks, toothbrushes, pomade pots, in a case recorded by Schroeder with a cockchafer inside, a makeshift substitute for the Japanese Urine no Tama, while in one recent English case a full-sized hen's egg was removed from the vagina of a middle-aged married woman. More than 9/10 of the foreign bodies found in the female bladder or urethra are due to masturbation. The age of the individuals in whom such objects has been found is usually from 17 to 30, but in a few cases they have been found in girls below 14. Infrequently in women between 40 and 50. The large objects, naturally, are found chiefly in the vagina, and in married women. Hairpins have, above all, been found in the female bladder with special frequency. This point is worth some consideration as the illustration of the enormous frequency of this form of autoerotism. The female urethra is undoubtedly a normal centre of sexual feeling, as Pollier pointed out many years ago. A woman medical correspondent, also, writes that in some women the maximum of voluptuous sensation is at the vesical sphincter or orifice, though not always so limited. E. H. Smith, indeed, considers that the urethra is the part in which the orgasm occurs, and remarks that in sexual excitement mucus always flows largely from the urethra. It should be added that when once introduced, the physiological mechanism of the bladder apparently causes the organ to tend to swallow the foreign object. Yet for every case in which the hairpin disappears and is lost in the bladder, from carelessness or the oblivion of the sexual spasm, there must be a vast number of cases in which the instrument is used without any such unfortunate result. There is thus great significance in the frequency with which cases of hairpin in the bladder are strewn through medical literature of all countries. In 1862, a German surgeon found the accident so common that he invented a special instrument for extracting the hairpins from the female bladder, as, indeed, Italian and French surgeons also have done. In France, Denucé, of Bordeaux, came to the conclusion that hairpin in the bladder is the commonest result of masturbation as known to the surgeon. In England, cases are constantly being recorded. Lawson Tate, stating that most cases of stone in the bladder in women are due to the introduction of a foreign body, very often a hairpin, adds, "I have removed hairpins encrusted with phosphates from 10 different female bladders, and not one of the owners of these bladders would give any account of the incident." Stokes again records that during 4 years he had 4 cases of hairpin in the female urethra. In New York one physician met with 4 cases in a short experience. In Switzerland Professor Reverdin had a precisely similar experience. There is, however, another class of material objects widely employed for producing physical autoerotism, which in the nature of things never reaches the surgeon. I refer to the effects that, naturally or unnaturally, may be produced by many of the objects and implements of daily life that do not normally come in direct contact with the sexual organs. Children sometimes, even when scarcely more than infants, produce sexual excitement by friction against the corner of a chair or other piece of furniture, and women sometimes do the same. Gutzit, in Russia, knew women who made a large knot in their chemises to rub against, and mentions a woman who would sit on her naked heel and rub it against her. Girls in France, I am informed, are fond of riding on the cheval de bois, or hobby horses, because of the sexual excitement thus aroused, and that the sexual emotions play a part in the fascination exerted by this form of amusement everywhere is indicated by the ecstatic faces of its devotees. At the temples in some parts of central India, I am told, swings are hung up in pairs, men and women swinging in these until sexually excited. During the months when the men in these districts have to be away from home, the girls put up swings to console themselves for the loss of their husbands. It is interesting to observe that the very wide prevalence of swinging, often of a religious or magic character, and the evident sexual significance underlying it, although this is not always clearly brought out. Greuze, discussing the frequency of swinging, refers, for instance, to the custom of the Gilbert Islanders for a young man to swing a girl from a cocoa palm, and then to cling on and swing with her. In ancient Greece, women and grown-up girls were fond of seesaws and swings. The Athenians had indeed a swinging festival. Songs of a voluptuous character, we gather from the Athenians, were sung by the women at this festival. J. G. Fraser discusses the question and brings forward instances in which men, or especially women, swing. The notion seems to be, he states, that the ceremony promotes fertility, whether in the vegetable or in the animal kingdom. Though why it should be supposed to do so, I confess myself unable to explain. The explanation seems, however, not far to seek, in view of the facts quoted above, and Fraser himself refers to the voluptuous character of the songs sometimes sung. Even apart from actual swinging of the whole body, a swinging movement may suffice to arouse sexual excitement, and may, at all events in women, constitute an essential part of methods of attaining solitary sexual gratification. Kiernan thus describes the habitual autoerotic procedure of a young American woman. The patient knelt before a chair, let her elbows drop on its seat, grasping the arms with a firm grip, then commenced a swinging, writhing motion, seeming to fix her pelvis, and moving her trunk and limbs. The muscles were rigid, the face took on a passionate expression, the features were contorted, the eyes rolled, the teeth were set, and the lips compressed, while the cheeks remained purple. The condition bore a striking resemblance to the passional stage of grand hysteria. The reveling took only a moment to commence, but lasted a long time. Swaying induced a pleasurable sensation, accompanied with a feeling of suction upon the clitoris. Almost immediately after, a sensation of bursting, caused by discharge from the vulvo-vaginal glands occurs, followed by a rapture prolonged for an indefinite time. The accompanying sexual imagery is so vivid as to become also hallucinatory. J.G. Kiernan, Sex Transformation and Psychic Impotence, American Journal of Dermatology, Volume 9, No. 2. Somewhat similarly, sensations of a sexual character are sometimes experienced by boys climbing up a pole. It is not even necessary that there should be direct external contact with the sexual organs, and Howe states that gymnastic swinging poles around which boys swing while supporting the whole weight on the hands may suffice to produce sexual excitement. Several writers have pointed out that the riding, especially in women, may produce sexual excitement and orgasm. It is well known, also, both in men and women, the vibratory motion of a railway train frequently produces a certain degree of sexual excitement, especially when sitting forward. Such excitement may remain latent and not become specifically sexual. I am not aware that this quality of railway traveling has ever been fostered as a sexual perversion, but the sewing machine has attracted considerable attention on account of its influence in exciting autoerotic manifestations. The early type of sewing machine, especially, was of a very heavy character, and involved much up and down movement of the legs. Langdon Down pointed out many years ago that this frequently produced some great sexual erotism which has led to masturbation. According to one French authority, it is a well-recognized fact that to work a sewing machine with the body in certain positions produces sexual excitement leading to orgasm. The occurrence of the orgasm is indicated to the observer by the machine being worked for a few seconds with uncontrollable rapidity. This sound is said to be frequently heard in large French workrooms, and it is a part of the duty of the superintendents to make the girls sit properly. During a visit which I once paid to a manufactory of military clothing, Polier writes, I witnessed the following scene. In the midst of the uniform sound produced by some 30 sewing machines, I suddenly heard one of the machines working with much more velocity than the others. I looked at the person who was working it, a brunette of 18 or 20. While she was automatically occupied with the trousers she was making on the machine, her face became animated, her mouth opened slightly, her nostrils dilated. Her feet moved the pedals with constantly increasing rapidity. Soon I saw a convulsive look in her eyes. Her eyelids were lowered. Her face turned pale and was thrown backward. Hands and legs stopped and became extended. A suffocated cry, followed by a long sigh, was lost in the noise of the workroom. The girl remained motionless for a few seconds, drew out her handkerchief to wipe away the pearls of sweat from her forehead, and after casting a timid and ashamed glance at her companions, resumed her work. The forewoman, who acted as my guide, having observed the direction of my gaze, took me up to the girl, who blushed, lowered her face, and murmured some incoherent words before the forewoman had opened her mouth to advise her to sit fully on the chair, and not sit on its edge. As I was leaving, I heard another machine at another part of the room in accelerated movement. The forewoman smiled at me, and remarked that it was so frequent that it attracted no notice. It was specially observed, she told me, in the case of young work-girls, apprentices, and those who sat on the edge of their seats, thus much facilitating friction of the labia. In cases where the sewing machine does not lead to direct self-excitement, it has been held, as by Fothergill, to predispose to frequency of involuntary sexual orgasm during sleep, from the irritation set up by the movement of the feet in sitting posture during the day. The essential movement in working the sewing machine is the flexion and extension of the ankle, but the muscles of the thighs are used to maintain the feet firmly on the treadle. The thighs are held together, and there is a considerable degree of flexion or extension of the thighs on the trunk. By a special adjustment of the body, and sometimes perhaps merely in the presence of sexual hyperesthesia, it is thus possible to act upon the sexual organs. But this is by no means a necessary result of using the sewing machine, and the inquiry of various women, with well-developed sexual feelings who are accustomed to work the treadle, has not shown the presence of any tendency in this direction. Sexual irritation may also be produced by the bicycle in women. Thus, Moll remarks that he knows many married women, and some unmarried, who experience sexual excitement when cycling. In several cases he has ascertained that the excitement is carried as far as complete orgasm. This result cannot, however, easily happen unless the seat is too high, the peak in contact with the organs, and a rolling movement is adopted. In the absence of marked hyperesthesia, these results are only affected by a bad seat or an improper attitude, the body during cycling resting under proper conditions on the buttocks, and the work being mainly done by the muscles of the thighs and legs which control the ankles, flexions of the thigh on the pelvis being very small. Most medical authorities on cycling are of opinion that when cycling leads to sexual excitement, the fault lies more with the woman than with the machine. The conclusion does not appear to me to be absolutely correct. I find on inquiry that with the old-fashioned saddle, with an elevated peak rising towards the pubes, a certain degree of sexual excitement, not usually producing the orgasm, but, as one lady expressed it, making one feel quite ready for it, is fairly common among women. Lightston finds that irritation of the genital organs may unquestionably be produced in both males and females by cycling. The aggravation of hemorrhoids sometimes produced by cycling indicates also the tendency to local congestion. With improved flat saddles, however, constructed with more definite adjustment to the anatomical formation of the parts, this general tendency is reduced to a negligible minimum. A reference may be made at this point to the influence of tight lacing. This has been recognized by gynecologists as a factor of sexual excitement and a method of masturbation. Women who have never worn corsets sometimes find that on first putting them on, sexual feeling is so intensified that it is necessary to abandon their use. The reason of this, as Siebert points out in his book for Eltern, seems to be that the corset both favors pelvic congestion and at the same time exerts a pressure on the abdominal muscles which brings them into the state produced during coitus. It is doubtless for the same reason, as some women have found, that more distension of the bladder is possible without corsets than with them. End of Autoeroticism, Part 1, Section 1.
Autoeroticism, a study of the spontaneous manifestations of the sexual impulse. Part 1, Section 2 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex, Volume 1, by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autoeroticism, a study of the spontaneous manifestations of the sexual impulse. Part 1, Section 2. In a further class of cases, no external object whatever is used to procure the sexual orgasm, but the more or less voluntary pressure of the thighs alone is brought to bear upon the sexual regions. It is done either when sitting or standing, the thighs being placed together and firmly crossed, and the pelvis rocked so that the sexual organs are pressed against the inner and posterior parts of the thighs. This is sometimes done by men and is fairly common among women, especially, according to Martineau, among those who sit much, such as dressmakers and milliners, those who use the sewing machine, and those who ride. Wedler remarks that in his experience in Scandinavia, thigh friction is the commonest form of masturbation in women. The practice is widespread, and a medical correspondent in India tells me of a Brahmin widow who confessed to this form of masturbation. I am told that in London board schools, at the present time, thigh rubbing is not infrequent among the girl scholars. The proportion mentioned in one school was about 10% of the girls over 11. The thigh rubbing is done more or less openly, and is interpreted by the uninitiated as due merely to a desire to relieve the bladder. It is found in female infants. Thus Townsend records the case of an infant 8 months old who would cross her right thigh over the left, close her eyes, and clench her fists. After a minute or two there would be complete relaxation, with sweating and redness of face. This would occur about once a week or oftener. The child was quite healthy, with no abnormal condition of the genital organs. The frequency of thigh friction among women as a form of masturbation is due to the fact that it is usually acquired innocently, and it involves no indecorum. The Soothso reports the case of a girl of 12 who at school, when having to wait her turn at the water closet, for fear of wetting herself, would put her clothes between her legs and press her thighs together, moving them backwards and forwards in the effort to control her bladder. She discovered that a pleasurable sensation was thus produced, and acquired the habit of practicing the maneuver for its own sake. At the age of 17 she began to vary it in different ways. Thus she would hang from a tree with her legs swinging and her chemise pressed between her thighs, which she would rub together. Thigh friction in some of its forms is so comparatively decorous a form of masturbation that it may even be performed in public places. Thus, a few years ago, while waiting for a train at a station on the outskirts of a provincial town, I became aware of the presence of a young woman sitting alone on a seat at a little distance, whom I could observe unnoticed. She was leaning back with legs crossed, swinging the crossed foot vigorously and continuously. This continued without interruption for 10 minutes after I first observed her. Then the swinging movement reached a climax. She leaned still further back, thus bringing the sexual region still more closely in contact with the edge of the bench, and straightened and stiffened her body and legs in what appeared to be a momentary spasm. There could be little doubt as to what had taken place. A few moments later she slowly walked from her solitary seat into the waiting room and sat down among the other waiting passengers. Quite still now, and with uncrossed legs, a pale, quiet young woman, possibly a farmer's daughter, serenely unconscious that her maneuver had been detected, and very possibly herself ignorant of its true nature. There are many other forms in which the impulse of autoerotism presents itself. Dancing is often a powerful method of sexual excitement, not only among civilized but among savage peoples, and Zach describes the erotic dances of Swahili women as having a masturbatory object. Stimulation of the nates is a potent adjuvant to the production of self-excitement, and self-flagellation with rods, etc., is practiced by some individuals, especially young women. Urtication is another form of this stimulation. Revedin knew a young woman who obtained sexual gratification by flogging herself with chestnut burrs, and it is stated that in some parts of France it is not uncommon for young girls to masturbate by rubbing the leaves of the Linearia cymbalarea, here called pinton or timbard, onto the sexual parts, thus producing a burning sensation. Stimulation of the mamma, normally an erogenous center in women, may occasionally serve as a method for obtaining autoerotic satisfaction, including the orgasm in both sexes. I have been told of a case in a man, and a medical correspondent in India informs me that he knows a Eurasian woman addicted to masturbation, who can only obtain the orgasm by rubbing the genitals with one hand, while with the other she rubs and finally squeezes her breasts. The tactile stimulation even of regions of the body which are not normally erogenous zones in either sex may sometimes lead on to sexual excitement. Hirschsprung, as well as Freud, believes that this is often the case as regards finger-sucking and toe-sucking in infancy. Even stroking the chin, remarks Daydream, may produce a pollution. Taylor refers to the case of a young woman of 22 who was liable to attacks of choric movements of the hands, which would terminate in alternately pressing the middle finger on the tip of the nose and the tragus of the ear, when a far-away pleased expression would appear on her face. She thus produced sexual excitement and satisfaction. She had no idea of wrongdoing, and was surprised and ashamed when she realized the nature of her act. Most of the foregoing examples of autoerotism are commonly included, by no means correctly, under the heading of masturbation. There are, however, a vast number of people possessing strong sexual emotions and living a solitary life who experience, sometimes by instinct and sometimes on moral grounds, a strong repugnance for these manifestations of autoerotism. As one highly intelligent lady writes, "I have sometimes wondered whether I could produce it, that is, complete sexual excitement, mechanically. But I have a curious, unreasonable repugnance to trying the experiment. It would materialize it too much." The same repugnance may be traced in the tendency to avoid, so far as possible, the use of hands. It is quite common to find this instinctive, unreasoning repugnance among women, a healthy repugnance not founded on any moral ground. In men, the same repugnance exists, more often combined with or replaced by a very strong moral and aesthetic objection to such practices. But the presence of such a repugnance, however invincible, is very far from carrying us outside the autoerotic field. The production of the sexual orgasm is not necessarily dependent on any external contact or voluntary mechanical cause. As an example, though not of specifically autoerotic manifestations, I may mention the case of a man of 57, a somewhat eccentric preacher, etc., who writes, "My whole nature goes out so to some persons, and they thrill and stir me so, that I have an emission while sitting by them, with no thought of sex, only the gladness of soul found its way out thus, and a glow of health suffused the whole body. There was no spasmodic conclusion, but a pleasing, gentle sensation, as a few drops of semen passed." In reality, no doubt not semen, but urethral fluid. This man's condition may certainly be considered somewhat morbid. He is attracted to both men and women, and the sexual impulse seems to be irritable and weak. But a similar state of things exists so often in women, no doubt due to sexual repression, and in individuals who are in a general state of normal and good health, that in these it can scarcely be called morbid. Brooding on sexual images, which the theologians termed delectatio amorosa, may lead to spontaneous orgasm in either sex, even in perfectly normal persons. Hammond described as a not uncommon form of psychic coitus, a condition in which the simple act of imagination alone, in the presence of the desired object, suffices to produce orgasm. In some public conveyance, theatre, or elsewhere, the man sees a desirable woman, and by concentrating his attention on her person and imagining all the states of intimacy, he quickly succeeds in producing orgasm. Nisfero refers to an Italian work girl of 14 who could obtain ejaculation of mucus 4 times a day in the workroom in the presence of the other girls, without touching herself or moving her body, by simply thinking of sexual things. If the orgasm occurs spontaneously, without the aid of mental impressions or any manipulations ad hoc, though under such conditions it ceases to be sinful from the theological standpoint, it certainly ceases also to be normal. Serio records the case of a somewhat neurotic woman of 50 who had been separated from her husband for 10 years and since lived a chaste life. At this age, however, she became subject to violent crises of sexual orgasm, which would come on without any accompaniment of voluptuous thoughts. McGillicuddy records 3 cases of spontaneous orgasms in women coming under his notice. Such crises are frequently found in both men and women who, from moral reasons, ignorance, or on other grounds, are restrained from attaining the complete sexual orgasm, but whose sexual emotions are, literally, continually dribbling from them. Schrenk Nurzisch knows a lady who is spontaneously sexually excited on hearing music or seeing pictures without anything lascivious in them. She knows nothing of sexual relationships. Another lady is sexually excited on seeing beautiful and natural scenes like the sea. Sexual ideas are mixed up in her mind with these things, and the contemplation of a specially strong and sympathetic man brings the orgasm on in about a minute. Both these ladies masturbate in the streets, restaurants, railways, theatres, without anyone perceiving it. A Brahmin woman informed a medical correspondent in India that she had distinct though feeble orgasm with copious outflow of mucus if she stayed long near a man whose face she liked, and this is not uncommon among European women. Evidently, under such conditions, there is a state of hyperesthetic weakness. Here, however, we are passing the frontiers of strictly autoerotic phenomena. Delectatio amorosa, as understood by the theologians, is distinct from desire, and also distinct from the definite intention of effecting the sexual act, although it may lead to those things. It is a voluntary and complacent dallying in imagination with voluptuous thoughts, when no effort is made to repel them. It is, as Aquinas and others point out, constituted by this act of complacent dallying, and has no reference to the duration of the imaginative process. Daydream, in his Machiology, deals fully with this question and quotes the opinions of theologians. I may add that in the early penitentials, before the elaboration of Catholic theology, the voluntary emission of semen through the influence of evil thoughts was recognized as a sin, though usually only if it occurred in church. In Egbert's penitential of the 8th or 9th century, the penance assigned for this offense in the case of a deacon is 25 days, in the case of a monk 30 days, a priest 40 days, a bishop 50. The frequency of spontaneous orgasm in women seems to have been recognized in the 17th century. Thus, Schurig, apparently quoting Riolin, states that some women are so wanton that the sight of a handsome man or of their lover, or speech with such a one, will cause them to ejaculate their semen. There is, however, a closely allied and indeed overlapping form of autoerotism which may be considered here. I mean that associated with reverie or daydreaming. Although this is a very common and important form of autoerotism, besides being in a large proportion of cases the early stage of masturbation, it appears to have attracted little attention. The daydream has indeed been studied in its chief form in the continued story by Mabel Learoyd of Wesley College. The continued story is an imagined narrative more or less peculiar to the individual, by whom it is cherished with fondness and regarded as an especially sacred mental possession to be shared only, if at all, with very sympathizing friends. It is commoner among girls and young women than among boys and young men. Among 352 persons of both sexes, 47% among the women, and only 14% among the men have any continued story. The starting point is an incident from a book, or more usually from actual experience, which the subject develops. The subject is nearly always the hero or the heroine of the story. The growth of the story is favored by solitude, and lying in bed before going to sleep is a time specially sacred to its cultivation. No distinct reference, perhaps naturally enough, is made by Miss Learoyd to the element of sexual emotion with which these stories are often strongly tinged, and which is frequently their real motive. Though by no means easy to detect, these elaborate and more or less erotic daydreams are not uncommon in young men, and especially in young women. Each individual has his own particular dream, which is always varying or developing, but except in very imaginative persons, to no great extent. Such a daydream is often founded on a basis of pleasurable personal experience and develops on that basis. It may evolve an element of perversity, even though that element finds no expression in real life. It is, of course, fostered by sexual abstinence, hence its frequency in young women. Most usually there is little attempt to realize it. It does not necessarily lead to masturbation, though it often causes some sexual congestion or even spontaneous sexual orgasm. The daydream is a strictly private and intimate experience, not only from its very nature, but also because it occurs in images which the subject finds great difficulty in translating into language, even when willing to do so. In other cases, it is elaborately dramatic or romantic in character. The hero or heroine passes through many experiences before attaining the erotic climax of the story. This climax tends to develop in harmony with the subject's growing knowledge or experience. At first merely a kiss, it may develop into any refinement of voluptuous gratification. The daydream may occur either in normal or abnormal persons. Rousseau, in his Confessions, describes such dreams, in his case combined with masochism and masturbation. A distinguished American novelist, Hamlin Garland, has admirably described in Rose of Duchess Cooley the part played in the erotic daydreams of a healthy normal girl at adolescence by a circus rider seen on the first visit to a circus, and becoming a majestic ideal to dominate the girl's thoughts for many years. Rafalovich describes a process by which insexual inverts the vision of a person of the same sex, perhaps seen in the streets or the theatre, is evoked in solitary reveries, producing a kind of psychic onanism, whether or not it leads to physical manifestations. Although daydreaming of this kind has at present been very little studied, since it loves solitude and secrecy, has never been counted of sufficient interest for scientific inquisition. It is really a process of considerable importance, and occupies a large part of the autoerotic field. It is frequently cultivated by refined and imaginative young men and women who lead a chaste life and would often be repelled by masturbation. In such persons, under such circumstances, it must be considered as strictly normal, the inevitable outcome of the play of the sexual impulse. No doubt it may often become morbid, and is never a healthy process when indulged in to excess, as it is liable to be by refined young people with artistic impulses, to whom it is in the highest degree seductive and insidious. As we have seen, however, daydreaming is far from always colored by sexual emotion. Yet it is a significant indication of its really sexual origin that, as I have been informed by persons of both sexes, even in these apparently non-sexual cases, it frequently ceases altogether on marriage. Even when we have eliminated all these forms of autoerotic activity, however refined, in which the subject takes a voluntary part, we have still left unexplored an important portion of the autoerotic field, a portion which many people are alone inclined to consider normal: sexual orgasm during sleep. That under conditions of sexual abstinence in healthy individuals there must inevitably be some autoerotic manifestations during waking life, a careful study of the facts compels us to believe. There can be no doubt also that under the same conditions the occurrence of the complete orgasm during sleep with, in men, seminal emissions is altogether normal. Even Zeus himself, as Pausanias has recorded, was liable to such accidents, a statement which, at all events, shows that to the Greek mind there was nothing derogatory in such an occurrence. The Jews, however, regarded it as an impurity, and the same idea was transmitted to the Christian Church and embodied in the word pollutio, by which the phenomenon was designated in ecclesiastical phraseology. According to Billeward and other theologians, pollution in sleep is not sin, unless voluntarily caused. If, however, it begins in sleep and is completed in the half-waking state with the sensation of pleasure, it is a venial sin. But it seems allowable to permit a nocturnal pollution to complete itself on awakening, if it occurs without intention, and St. Thomas even says, "Si pollutio placeat ut naturae exoneratio vel alleviatio pectum non creditur." Notwithstanding the fair and logical position of the more distinguished Latin theologians, there has certainly been a widely prevalent belief in Catholic countries that pollution during sleep is a sin. In the Parson's Tale, Chaucer makes the parson say, "Another sin appertaineth to lechery that cometh in sleeping, and the sin cometh oft to them that be maidens, and eke to them that be corrupt. And this sin men clepe pollution, that cometh in 4 manners, these 4 manners being, number 1, languishing of body from rank and abundant humours; number 2, infirmity; 3, surfeit of meat and drink; 4, villainous thoughts." 400 years later, Madame Roland, in her Memoirs Particulières, presented a vivid picture of the anguish produced in an innocent girl's mind by the notion of the sinfulness of erotic dreams. She menstruated first at the age of 14. Before this, she writes, "I had sometimes been awakened from the deepest sleep in a surprising manner. Imagination played no part. I exercised it on too many serious subjects, and my timorous conscience preserved it from amusement with other subjects, so that it could not represent what I would not allow it to seek to understand. But an extraordinary effervescence aroused my senses in the heat of repose, and, by virtue of my excellent constitution, operated by itself a purification which was as strange to me as its cause. The first feeling which resulted was, I know not why, a sort of fear. I had observed in my philauty that we are not allowed to obtain any pleasure from our bodies except in lawful marriage. What I had experienced could be called a pleasure. I was then guilty, and in a class of offences which caused me the most shame and sorrow, since it was that which was most displeasing to the spotless Lamb. There was great agitation in my poor heart, prayers and mortifications. How could I avoid it? For indeed I had not foreseen it, but at the instant when I experienced it, I had not taken the trouble to prevent it. My watchfulness became extreme. I scrupulously avoided positions which I found specially exposed me to the accident. My restlessness became so great that at last I was able to awake before the catastrophe. When I was not in time to prevent it, I would jump out of bed, with naked feet, onto the polished floor, and with crossed arms pray to the Saviour to preserve me from the wiles of the devil. I would then impose some penance on myself, and I have carried out to the letter what the Prophet King probably only transmitted to us as a figure of Oriental speech, mixing ashes with my bread and watering it with my tears. End of Autoeroticism, Part 1, Section 2. Autoeroticism, a study of the spontaneous manifestations of the sexual impulse. Part 1, Section 3 of Studies in the Psychology of Sex. Volume 1 by Havelock Ellis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Autoeroticism, a study of the spontaneous manifestations of the sexual impulse. Part 1, Section 3. To the early Protestant mind, as illustrated by Luther, there was something diseased, though not impure, in sexual excitement during sleep. Thus, in his Table Talk, Luther remarks that girls who have such dreams should be married at once, taking the medicine which God has given. It is only of comparatively recent years that medical science has obtained currency for the belief that this autoerotic process is entirely normal. Blumenbach stated that nocturnal emissions are normal. Sir James Paget declared that he had never known celibate men who had not such emissions from once or twice a week to twice every 3 months, both extremes being within the limits of good health, while Sir Lauder Brunton considers once a fortnight or once a month about the usual frequency, at these periods the emissions often following 2 nights in succession. Rolder believes that they may normally follow for several nights in succession. Hammond considers that they occur about once a fortnight. Ribbing regards 10 to 14 days as a normal interval. Lowenfeld puts the normal frequency at about once a week. This seems to be nearer the truth as regards most fairly healthy young men. In proof of this it is only necessary to refer to the exact records of healthy young adults summarized in the Study of Periodicity in the present volume. It occasionally happens, however, that nocturnal emissions are entirely absent. I am acquainted with some cases. In other fairly healthy young men they seldom occur except at times of intellectual activity or of anxiety and worry. Lately there has been some tendency for medical opinion to revert to the view of Luther, and to regard sexual excitement during sleep as a somewhat unhealthy phenomenon. Moll is a distinguished advocate of this view. Sexual excitement during sleep is a normal result of celibacy. but it is another thing to say that it is, on that account, satisfactory. We might then, Moll remarks, maintain that nocturnal incontinence of urine is satisfactory, since the bladder is thus emptied. Yet we take every precaution against this by insisting that the bladder shall be emptied before going to sleep. This remark is supported by the fact, to which I find that both men and women can bear witness, that sexual excitement during sleep is more fatiguing than in the waking state, though this is not an invariable rule, and it is sometimes found to be refreshing. In a similar way, Eulenburg states that nocturnal emissions are no more normal than coughing or vomiting. Nocturnal emissions are usually, though not invariably, accompanied by dreams of a voluptuous character, in which the dreamer becomes conscious in a more or less fantastic manner of the more or less intimate presence or contact of a person of the opposite sex. It would seem, as a general rule, that the more vivid and voluptuous a dream, the greater is the physical excitement, and the greater also the relief experienced on awakening. Sometimes the erotic dream occurs without any emission, and not infrequently the emission takes place after the dreamer has awakened. The widest and most comprehensive investigation of erotic dreams is that carried out by Gualino in northern Italy, and based on inquiries among 100 normal men, doctors, teachers, lawyers, etc., who had all had experience of the phenomenon. Gualino shows that erotic dreams with emissions, whether or not seminal, began somewhat earlier than the period of physical development as ascertained by Marro for youths of the same part of northern Italy. Gualino found that all his cases had had erotic dreams at the age of 17. Marro found 8% of youths still sexually underdeveloped at that age, and while sexual development began at 13 years, erotic dreams began at 12. Their appearance was preceded, in most cases for some months, by erections. In 37% of the cases there had been no actual sexual experiences, either masturbation or intercourse. In 23% there had been masturbation. In the rest, some form of sexual contact. The dreams are mainly visual, tactual elements coming second, and the dramatis persona is either an unknown woman or only known by sight, and in the majority is, at all events in the beginning, an ugly or fantastic figure, becoming more attractive later in life, but never identical with the woman loved during waking life. This, as Gualino points out, accords with the general tendency for the emotions of the day to be latent in sleep. Masturbation only formed the subject of the dream in 4 cases. The emotional state in the pubertal stage, apart from pleasure, was 37% anxiety, 17% desire, 14% fear. In the adult stage, anxiety and fear receded to 7% and 6% respectively. 33 of the subjects, as a result of sexual or general disturbances, had had nocturnal emissions without dreams. These were always found exhausting. Normally, erotic dreams are the most vivid of all dreams. In no case was there knowledge of any monthly or other cyclic periodicity in the occurrence of the manifestations. In 34% of cases, they tended to occur very soon after sexual intercourse. In numerous cases, they were peculiarly frequent during courtship, when the young man was in the habit of kissing and caressing his betrothed, but ceased after marriage. It was not noted that position in bed or a full bladder exerted any marked influence in the occurrence of erotic dreams. Repletion of the seminal vesicles is regarded as a main factor. In Germany, erotic dreams have been discussed by Volkelt, and especially by Lowenfeld, while in America Stanley Hall thus summarizes the general characteristics of erotic dreams in men. In by far the most cases, consciousness, even when the act causes full awakening from sleep, finds only scattered images, single words, gestures, and acts, many of which would perhaps normally constitute no provocation. Many times the mental activity seems to be remote and incidental, and the mind retains in the morning nothing except perhaps a peculiar dress pattern, the shape of a fingernail, the back of a neck, the toss of a head, the movement of a foot, or the dressing of the hair. In such cases, these images stand out for a time with the distinctness of a cameo and suggest that the origin of erotic fetishisms is largely to be found in sexual dreams. Very rarely is there any imagery of the organs themselves, but the tendency to irradiation is so strong as to reinforce the suggestion of so many other phenomena in this field, that nature designs this experience to be long-circuited, and that it may give a peculiar ictus to almost any experience. When waking occurs just afterward, it seems at least possible that there may be much imagery that existed, but failed to be recalled to memory, possibly because the flow of psychic impressions was over very familiar fields, and this, therefore, was forgotten, while any eruption into new or unwonted channels stood out with distinctness. All these psychic phenomena, although very characteristic of man in his prime, are not so of the dreams of dawning puberty, which are far more vivid. I may further quote the experience of an anonymous contributor, a healthy and chaste man between 30 and 38 years of age, to the American Journal of Psychology. Legs and breasts often figured prominently in these dreams, the other sexual parts, however, very seldom, and then they turned out to be male organs in most cases. There were but 2 instances of copulation dreamt. Girls and young women were the usual dramatis personae, and curiously enough often the aggressors. Sometimes the face or faces were well known, sometimes only once seen, sometimes entirely unknown. The orgasm occurs at the most erotic part of the dream, the physical and psychical running parallel. This most erotic or suggestive part of the dream was very often quite an innocent-looking incident enough, as for example, while passing a strange young woman overtaken on the street, she calls after me some question. At first I pay no heed, but when she calls again, I hesitate whether to turn back and answer or not. Emission. Again, walking beside a young woman, she said, "Shall I take your arm?" I offered, and she took it, entwining her arm around it and raising it high. Emission. I could feel stronger erection as she asked the question. Sometimes a word was enough, sometimes a gesture. Once emission took place on my noticing the young woman's diminished fingernails. Another example of fetishism was my being curiously attracted in a dream by the pretty embroidered figure on a little girl's dress. As an illustration of the strange metamorphoses that occur in dreams, I, one night, in my dream, fell in love with a partridge, which changed under my caresses to a beautiful girl, who yet retained an indescribable wild bird innocence, grace, and charm, a sort of Undina. These experiences may be regarded as fairly typical of the erotic dreams of healthy and chaste young men. The bird, for instance, that changes into a woman while retaining some elements of the bird, has been encountered in erotic dreams by other young men. It is indeed remarkable that, as de Gubertinus observes, the bird is a well-known phallic symbol, while Maeder finds that birds have a sexual significance both in life and in dreams. The appearance of male organs in the dream woman is doubtless due to the dreamer's greater familiarity with those organs, but though it occurs occasionally, it can scarcely be said to be the rule in erotic dreams. Even men who have never had connection with a woman are quite commonly aware of the presence of a woman's sexual organs in their erotic dreams. Moll's comparison of nocturnal emissions of semen with nocturnal incontinence of urine suggests an interesting resemblance, and at the same time seeming contrast. In both cases we are concerned with viscera which, when overfilled or unduly irritable, spasmodically eject their contents during sleep. There is a further resemblance which usually becomes clear when, as occasionally happens, nocturnal incontinence of urine persists on to late childhood or adolescence. Both phenomena are frequently accompanied by vivid dreams of appropriate character. Thus, in one case known to me, a child of 7 who occasionally wetted the bed usually dreamed at the same time that she wanted to make water, and was out of doors, running to find a suitable spot, which she at last found, and on awakening discovered that she had wetted the bed. 15 years later she still sometimes had similar dreams, which caused her much alarm until, when thoroughly awake, she realized that no accident had happened. These later dreams were not the result of any strong desire to urinate. In another case with which I am acquainted, a little girl of 8, after mental excitement or indigestible meals, occasionally wetted the bed, dreaming that she was frightened by some one running after her, and wetted herself in consequence, after the manner of the Ganymede in Eagle's Clutch, as depicted by Rembrandt. These two cases, it may be noted, belong to two quite different types. In the first case the full bladder suggests to imagination the appropriate actions for relief, and the bladder actually accepts the imaginative solution offered. It is, according to Fiorene's phrase, somnambulism of the bladder. In the other case there is no such somnambulism, but a psychic and nervous disturbance, not arising in the bladder at all, irradiates convulsively, and whether or not the bladder is overfull, attacks a vesical nervous system which is not yet sufficiently well balanced to withstand the inflow of excitement. In children of somewhat nervous temperament, manifestations of this kind may occur as an occasional accident up to about the age of 7 or 8, and thereafter, the nervous control of the bladder having become firmly established, they cease to happen, the nervous energy required to affect the bladder sufficing to wake the dreamer. In very rare cases, however, the phenomenon may still occasionally happen, even in adolescence or later, in individuals who are otherwise quite free from it. This is most apt to occur in young women, even in waking life. In men it is probably extremely rare. The erotic dream seems to differ flagrantly from the vesical dream, in that it occurs in adult life, and is with difficulty brought under control. The contrast is, however, very superficial. When we remember that sexual activity only begins normally at puberty, we realize that the youth of 20 is, in the matter of sexual control, scarcely much older than in the matter of vesical control he was at the age of 6. Moreover, if we were habitually, from our earliest years, to go to bed with a full bladder, as a chaste man goes to bed with unrelieved sexual system, it would be fully as difficult to gain vesical control during sleep as it now is to gain sexual control. Ultimately, such sexual control is attained. After the age of 40, it seems that erotic dreams with emission become more and more rare. Either the dream occurs without actual emission, exactly as dreams of urination occur in adults with full bladder, or else the organic stress, with or without dreams, serves to awaken the sleeper before any emission has occurred. But this stage is not easily or completely attained. St. Augustine, even in the period when he wrote his Confessions, mentions as a matter of course that sexual dreams not merely arouse pleasure, but gain the consent of the will. Not infrequently there is a struggle in sleep, just as the hypnotic subject may resist suggestions. Thus, a lady of 35 dreamed a sexual dream, and awoke without excitement. Again she fell asleep, and had another dream of sexual character, but resisted the tendency to excitement, and again awoke. Finally, she fell asleep and had a third sexual dream, which was this time accompanied by the orgasm. The factors involved in the acquirement of vesicle and sexual control during sleep are the same, but the conditions are somewhat different. There is a very intimate connection between the vesicle and the sexual spheres, as I have elsewhere pointed out. This connection is psychic as well as organic. Both in men and women, a full bladder tends to develop erotic dreams. Raymond and Janet state that nocturnal incontinence of urine, accompanied by dreams of urination, may be replaced at puberty by masturbation. In the reverse direction, Freud believes that masturbation plays a large part in causing the bedwetting of children who have passed the age when that usually ceases, and he even finds that children are themselves aware of the connection. The diagnostic value of sexual dreams, as an indication of the sexual nature of the subject when awake, has been emphasized by various writers. Sexual dreams tend to reproduce and even to accentuate those characteristics which make the strongest sexual appeal to the subject when awake. At the same time, this general statement has to be qualified, more especially as regards inverted dreams. In the first place, a young man, however normal, who is not familiar with the feminine body when awake, is not likely to see it when asleep, even in dreams of women. In the second place, the confusions and combinations of dream imagery often tend to obliterate sexual distinctions, however free from perversions the subjects may be. Thus, a correspondent tells me of a healthy man of very pure character, totally inexperienced in sexual matters, and never having seen a woman naked, who, in his sexual dreams, always sees a woman with male organs, though he has never had any sexual inclinations for men, and is much in love with a lady. The confusions and associations of dream imagery leading to abnormal combinations may be illustrated by a dream which once occurred to me after reading Joest's account of how a young negress, whose tattoo marks he was sketching, having become bored, suddenly pressed her hands to her breast, spurting 2 streams of lukewarm milk into his face, and ran away laughing. I dreamed of a woman performing a similar action, not from her breasts, however, but from a penis with which she was furnished. Again, by another kind of confusion, a man dreams sexually that he is with a man, although the figure of the partner revealed in the dream is a woman. The following dream in a normal man who had never been or wished to be in the position shown by the dream may be quoted. I dreamed that I was a big boy, and that a younger boy lay close beside me, and that we, or certainly he, had seminal emissions. I was complacently passive, and had a feeling of shame when the boy was discovered. On awaking, I found I had no emission, but I was lying very close to my wife. The day before I had seen boys in a swimming match. This was, it seems to me, an example of dream confusion, and not an erotic inverted dream. End of Autoeroticism, Part 1, Section 3.